When Heather asked me if I would be willing to do an ADA talk, one of the things I remember saying to her was, I'm not sure I can fill the time slot in a half an hour. And then as I began to put this presentation together, I was reminded that I spent half of my career in a job where I was paid to speak for 20 minutes, whether I had anything to say or not. And then I became a teacher, and that extended to 50 minutes without any preparation, and 90 minutes with just a look in the textbook. So in order to maintain time, I brought something that I hope somebody will... Would you time me? I want to talk about how the measurement of language has changed in recent history, in recent times. And that may not sound really interesting to you, so I did bring some props. How do you go about measuring language ability? Think about that. I've done this with one of the assessment classes. If you had to measure somebody's language ability, how would you do it? What would you look at? And so I designed a metaphor. And that metaphor is chalk dust. How do you go about measuring chalk dust or chalk? You know how hard this was to find? Well, chalk's an interesting word, and it relates to language a whole lot. Do you know you can have a group of pencils, right? You can have a group of pens, but you can't have a group of chalks. You can only have chalk. And so if I'm talking about measuring chalk, I have to do something else. And we commonly talk about pieces of chalk. That's what this says. There are 12 yellow sticks of chalk. But on that basis, that is the same as that, is the same as that. They're all pieces or sticks of chalk. So when you talk about language, what do we mean by language? And how are we going to measure that? In addition, here's two more chalk. This one is called chalk marker, and it's not chalk at all. It's some kind of liquid. And this is welder's chalk. If you sew, you know about fabric chalk or tailor's chalk. And that's not chalk at all. So, like language, we have a whole bunch of things that bear the name, but really aren't the substance. How do you measure language? I have a box of chalk. This was easier to find. How much chalk is in here? Well, there's 32 sticks.
Big fat ones.
Anybody want to guess what size those sticks are? Do I have a lot of chalk? Or do I really have a box with just a little chalk in it? You don't know?
It doesn't say.
No, it doesn't. And then I have my favorite. Chalk dust. Unlike the other forms of chalk, I know exactly what's in here. There is 4 ounces. There are 4 ounces. 113 grams of chalk. This test is reliable because it doesn't matter who comes up or when you come up and look at this jar, there's still 4 ounces, 113 grams. That's the ultimate in assessment reliability. If I look at it tomorrow, there will either be 113 grams, or I can explain to you the amount of increase or the amount of decrease. It's also a very valid test. If I have 4 ounces of talcum powder, I can compare them. If I have 4 ounces of rocks, I can compare that. There's a standard of measure that we all agree on. We know what an ounce or a gram is. Reliable test, valid test. The only question is, who cares? Right? If I buy that container, I'm glad that it says 4 ounces, but it means absolutely nothing to me. I could say 10 ounces and I'd still buy it. It could say 2.5 ounces. 1.5 ounces, I'm going to carry it on the airplane. And it doesn't matter. Because I buy chalk not for its measurement size, but because I can do something with it. And the only question that's really important to me in chalk is there enough chalk in this tube to do the job I need to do with the chalk? And that's a metaphor for language testing and language assessment. If there's nothing that you remember from the next 20 minutes, I want you to remember 2 things. Measuring chalk dust and a little Turkish student named Özlem. After the wars came, World War II and the Korean War, American universities began to be flooded with students coming from overseas to study here. Before that time, the way we assessed language skills is we looked at transcripts. Oh, they had French for 3 years, and they got 2 A's and a B. They're ready to study in France. Let me tell you about this. I was a high school French student. I studied French for 2 years. And if my memory is right, I got an A the first year and a B the second year. And you know where this is going, don't you? As my senior gift, my parents decided we would vacation in Quebec, Canada. Because we have Bill here who can translate for us. So off we went to Quebec. And I did a really good job. I read road signs. They didn't get lost. And I actually picked up a newspaper and was amazed by the fact that I had some idea what that newspaper was about. We went into a restaurant to have lunch, and I picked up the menu, and I told my parents what there was to eat. And the waitress comes to our table, and it's really lucky I had an index finger, or we'd still be eating there to this day. And there were some things that weren't on the menu in those days, and I wanted a glass of milk. I got coffee. And when I said to the waitress, bonjour, she said to me something I have no idea. So we learned very quickly that transcripts are not good assessments for language learning. They cover a mask of issues. And when all the students began to come to the United States to study from lands around the world, we discovered very quickly that transcripts were not helpful in knowing whether students would be successful or unsuccessful. And so a group of about 30 universities and some language testers got together in 1963 in Washington, D.C. and said, we need some way to figure out what the language abilities are of the students who are coming into the United States. And they created with the National Testing Council an instrument, and they pilot tested it, and it is what is known today as the TOEFL test. It's an interesting test. When you sit down to raise the question of how do you assess language knowledge, what do you look at? Well, do you remember our chalk at our chalk desk? You look at the structures. There are 12 sticks. There is one tube of 4 ounces, and there are 32 sticks. You measure language, vocabulary. We can count how many words that student knows. Grammar. We can read a paper and figure out if they've made any mistakes, and we can count those. We can talk to them and figure out if they got the gist of what we're saying or not, and if they can figure out 1 or 2 details they heard in that conversation. And that's the way the test was put together. They counted student errors, not the good parts. They counted the mistakes, and they came up with a TOEFL score. And then they took this instrument and they tested all over with it, and they looked at students and said, he got a 490, and I notice he's not doing real well in his classes. She got a 570. And look at that, she's getting A's and B's. And so they took this range of scores and said, magic numbers, 500, 520, 535, 550, and 600. Admission to general schools, admissions to moderately selective schools, admissions to highly selective schools, admissions to very selective schools, and graduate work. And it's always been interesting to me about the value of those numbers. Somebody gets a 520, I know what that means. They got a 513, what is that? They got a 460, I got it, okay. They got a 462. This magic power of numbers. And the other thing they did, because remember, language teaching was happening the same way. That's the way I learned French. I learned structure. I learned vocabulary. I learned to read short passages. I learned the grammar. That's the way they tested. In those early years, you tested listening, reading, and structure. And then you put those three scores together, and you got an average, and that's where the 500 and the 520 came from. And for a lot of years, that worked just fine. TOEFL test has been taken by more than 30 million people around the world as of count this year. But strange things began to happen. I think the ultimate source was somebody figured out what happened to me in that restaurant in Quebec and began to spread the word. And they found out that all of these numbers don't have a great deal of meaning. Enter Ruslan. I taught in Turkey for 3 years, and Ruslan was a member of my second year's class. She was a student from the eastern part of Turkey, from a small village, not a very good school system, very traditional in dress, very traditional in beliefs, highly motivated student. She was admitted to the program in theoretical physics, and she may have been and may yet be the smartest student I have ever worked with in my life. She came to Koç. Koç was one of the two top-tier institutions in Turkey, but private. There are two of them, Sabancı and Koç, both operated by families of tremendous wealth and economic power in the country. These two universities, in fact, trained most of their future employees for banking, for grocery and agriculture, for trucking, for car sales. So if you came to Koç or you came to Sabancı, you not only knew you were getting a good education, you had a job when you graduated. And if you didn't want a job, you had an automatic admission to any graduate program anywhere in the world. So, Ruslan decided that she would come to Koç. Oh, there's one other issue I forgot to tell you. Little village, rural community, Koç offered scholarships. And based on her college preparation scores, she got a full ride to this university. But given her educational background, she didn't know English. She started almost at ground zero. If she had an English class in her life, it was really hard to find any evidence of it. But at Koç, you had a full year and a summer term to move from that level to admission status in the university. To go from low TOEFL score to 550. I don't know that I've ever known a student to work quite as hard as Ruslan did. You never found her in parties, you never found her anywhere but in the library. Information center. I had her in level 1, I had her again in level 3, I had her again in level 5. When she finished the year of study, her final TOEFL score was 537. Translated not enough. She stayed the extra term, and I was gone that summer, so I don't know exactly what happened in term 6. But I know tutorials went crazy in that term. All of the faculty had students in special meetings. You intensified the instructional program. When I came back in September, I found out that last TOEFL was 546. And she went home. Excluded from the university for the lack of points. I have no idea what's happened to Uzlan in the interim. All I know is when I got back to coach, she was back in her little village, probably with the economic wealth that her family and village has. She never went to college. On the basis of a score of 546. There's power in these mythical numbers. It doesn't really end there. As language teaching has changed, the TOEFL has changed. In measure, it no longer tests these discrete skills. The new TOEFL tests integrated skills, so you may read something and then have to speak about what you read. Or you may read something and have to write an essay on something that you've read. And the conversations in the modern TOEFL are drawn directly from academic classrooms across the United States. The language that we now teach, the language students learn, is the same. And it wasn't even 20 years ago. But there have been other works afoot. In 1996, in a vastly different population, remember the purpose of the TOEFL is one purpose. Does this student have enough language skills to succeed in university studies? That's the design of the TOEFL. Well, we had high schools all over the country that were teaching modern languages, and they didn't have to worry about that. They could ask the question, what does it mean to know German? What does it mean to know French? Should I stop?
You keep going. You're the last
You
one.
can leave. You've got What does it mean to know any of the languages that we taught? And ACTFL, the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, developed a whole new assessment process, and it's called can-do statements. At a given level of language, what can a student do with the language that they have? And they marked off skills, intermediate, beginners, advanced, and all of those skills were built around what can a student do. Can they hold a conversation with another person using a variety of vocabulary in an area of interest they know? If you can do that, you're an intermediate student according to the ACTFL. Doesn't matter how big your vocabulary is, whether the grammatical proficiency is there, you can do this thing. And then beyond ACTFL, do you remember across the pond, there is now this network of nations that we call the European Union, and they speak English, French, and German, and Hungarian, and the list goes on. They have people moving back and forth across the borders, going to work, going to school, just changing where they're living, and they had to ask the question, how do we know if they know the language? And to what degree? And they, building on the IELTS, which is the British kind of TOEFL, put together and are in the midst of putting together a long list of functional language statements related to every one of the language skills. And that document, which is called CEFR, Common European Framework of Languages, or CEFR, or CFR, depending on where you're talking about it, is going to work to design language programs and language assessments that make sense in terms of the functionality. What can a student do with the language that they know at the level that they know it? And it is utterly transforming the world of language teaching and language learning. I never would have graduated from French if they asked me what I could do with the language. I'm glad they were using that system. But now, someone like Uzlan, who is a good student with great study habits, who can do most of the things that are required of a student at the college level, would be a theoretical physicist somewhere in the world. And I'd like to suggest to you that's a good change. It does mean language programs like ours at ONU are going to have to change. We've used the ITP, which is a TOEFL, ever since I've been here. It's cheap, I can score it quickly, it's available, no problem. but it measures the wrong things. The new tools that are just coming on the market have some pretty big holes in them. That is to say, we know that they're valid, we don't know that they're particularly reliable. I have 2 students right now in my program. One of them is a low intermediate student who scored at the advanced level on the CFA test that we gave them. We gave them another test and they scored truly at intermediate. So we've got to figure out, it isn't just can you hold a conversation, but can you hold a good conversation? Or can you just get by? That distinction has not yet happened in CFR. I went to a workshop in Innsbruck this summer where we worked on reading and listening assessments. I'm going to go back to Bremen this February, I think, where they're going to raise the question about the holes in the CFR system. What is it that's not being measured? It gives us information we need to know. But it's an exciting new day. Students finally can begin to be assessed based on what they can do with language, which is what language is all about. We don't buy chalk to measure it, we buy chalk to use it. And I think we're getting there in language as well. Thank you.